Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie. And in this video, I'm going to be looking at the weekend of October the 18th and 19th, 2025. I also want to look at the horoscope of Zohran Mamdani. He is standing to be mayor of New York City, and as far as the odds are concerned, I mean the betting odds, it looks as if he is a racing certainty. So I'm not making any astrological predictions about whether he's going to win or lose, because there's no point, because apparently he is going to win. That's what the pundits say. That's what the betting odds say. I was looking at sort of poly markets, and they were saying he had a 90% chance of winning. So that's not a subject I'm going to consider. Instead, I'm just going to be looking at his horoscope. I have looked at his horoscope before, and so as it is his birthday, October the 18th, he's going to be he's going to be 34. So he's very young to be a mayor of New York, but looks as if he's going to make it. And there is a question of will he be a successful mayor? But I'll be looking at that at the end of this video. But first of all, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for the weekend. Here is the chart for the weekend, set for midnight on October the 19th, 2025. And so at New York, of course, and the moon is at 29 degrees 59 Virgo. So, that is very convenient. It means that if you're in New York you're on the east coast, then that means that Saturday is a moon in Virgo day, Sunday is a moon in Libra day. Now, if you are in the UK, the moon moves into Libra at 5:01 a.m. London time. So even Europe, Africa, you can pretty much say that Sunday is all about moon in Libra. If you are in Australia or New Zealand, then the moon will not move into Libra until quite late on Sunday. So that's one thing going on this weekend, and it just could be that Saturday and Sunday are rather different days. Now, starting with Saturday, well, the big aspect on Saturday is probably the moon moving towards an opposition of Saturn. So moon-Saturn opposition, moon in Virgo, opposition Saturn in Pisces. That can be quite a difficult influence. It can be that something feels blocked, and quite what is blocking us may be difficult to define. Moon in Virgo tries to get it right, tries to do things by the book, but Saturn comes along and just messes things up. Saturn could represent emotion being applied in the wrong directions. Emotion, we think of flow with emotion. That's often how we see it. The emotionals moving. I don't know, emotionals, is that really a word? But things are moving. That's how we see emotions. But with Saturn in Pisces, it can be emotion that is stuck. It's rather like mud. And, that can be a problem, and it could just be other people brooding, people sitting on their feelings. Perhaps we ourselves could be sitting on our feelings. So that Moon-Saturn opposition could make Saturday a somewhat difficult day. And, additionally, this Moon opposition Saturn is tied up with the nodal axis. Saturn and the North Node are quite close to one another. Likewise, the Moon and the South Node are perhaps, they're not exactly in conjunction, but they are certainly in the same sign. And so the question is, what is the right approach? Moon conjunct the South Node can perhaps just be about focusing too much on the wrong things, perhaps getting caught up in material detail and not thinking about the bigger picture. Whereas Saturn in the North Node, Saturn in Pisces conjunct the North Node, is maybe saying something about how we need to be emotional, need to have an understanding of the emotional dimension, but we mustn't get carried away with it all. We need to be realistic. We need to be Saturnine. Also on Saturday, we've got a couple of good aspects. We've got the moon in Virgo making a sextile to Mercury, sextile to Mars, sextile to Jupiter. So you've got there you go. You've got Mercury and Mars moving towards a conjunction, and there's Jupiter. So the moon starts the weekend being sextile to Mercury and Mars, and then later on Saturday it makes a sextile to Jupiter. So maybe that moon opposition Saturn isn't quite so bad. And also notice that Jupiter is moving towards a trine with Saturn, and this aspect gets pretty close to being exact, but it doesn't get all the way there. So the reason for that is that Jupiter is getting ready to go retrograde. And so if we track Jupiter and Saturn through the signs, they get close. They get let me see. Yeah, it's just Jupiter gets so close to that trine, but it just doesn't quite make it. I mean, really, it is a close run thing, but I think that with this Jupiter trine Saturn, it's close enough to make a difference, and that might be something about November. And Jupiter trine Saturn, it's an aspect which is about the collective. It's quite a political aspect. It can be about the business cycle, and it's about the economy. Now, it may be that in November there is a feeling of stability and balance as Jupiter and Saturn make the trine, and sort of the moon is, as we know, moon is sextile Jupiter opposition Saturn. So perhaps we need to be focusing on the sextile to Jupiter rather than the opposition to Saturn. Rather than thinking about differences, maybe we should be thinking about how we can be similar to other people. Where the similarities are, we should really try to focus on them. But it may be hard, because I think that moon Saturn opposition could be somewhat problematic. And then moving into Sunday, moon moves into Libra. Moon makes an opposition to Neptune. So moon in Libra opposition Neptune in Aries, that Neptune getting really close to the Aries point. There can be moments of confusion. We try to be reasonable. Moon in Libra, we try to deal with people in an even and harmonious way, but it can be difficult, because not everyone is going to behave, not everyone is going to be reasonable, and that's just the way it is. Though that moon opposition Neptune, isn't the only thing going on. The moon is making a trine to Uranus and a trine to Pluto. So that does mean that on Sunday there is a grand trine in air signs. So moon in Libra, trine Uranus. Uranus is trine Pluto. Moon is trine Pluto. So there is activity, action, and Venus is actually quite close to making a trine to Uranus and making a trine to Pluto. Okay, Venus is starting to separate from those trines, but maybe the moon brings it all together. So overall, I would have said that for most of us, Sunday might be a somewhat easier day than Saturday. I think that Saturday could be just dominated by that moon opposition Saturn, whereas Sunday with the moon in Libra, we have got this grand trine in air signs, and there just could be more of a flow, and it might not be all about just emotions, but it might just be about thoughts, ideas, and if we want to talk about stuff without getting too serious on Sunday, I think that we can. One other aspect we've got on Sunday is a quincunx between the Sun and Saturn. So the Sun in late Libra is making an 150-degree aspect to Saturn in Pisces. So there's something that some of us need to sort out. Sun quincunx Saturn can be about a heaviness, and something just is preventing us from being ourselves. And it's all about responsibility, maybe. And perhaps a challenge with Sun quincunx Saturn is to take responsibility. It just may be required of us. It might seem like a really heavy task, but if we are prepared to confront the task and do what we're supposed to do, then I don't think that this Sun quincunx Saturn will be such a problem. So that's the picture in New York. If we set the chart for Sydney, Australia, then at midnight on Sunday, the moon is at 22 Virgo. And then, that just tells us that in Australia and in New Zealand, there's still quite a lot of mileage in the moon in Virgo, and the moon won't move into Virgo until it's pretty late on Sunday. So what I'm saying about, sorry, did I say moon in Virgo? I mean moon in Libra. The moon won't move into Libra until late on Sunday. Although when it does eventually move into Libra, it will make that grand trine in air signs. But that grand trine in air signs will just take some time to develop. So it won't be until sort of quite late in the weekend, but it all comes together. And then there is the heliocentric view, putting the Sun at the center of the solar system. So here is the chart. Mars is now exactly sextile Pluto, and this Mars sextile Pluto may allow some of us to really assert ourselves. If there's something that we want and we feel we need to be taken seriously, then I think that the Mars sextile Pluto should help. So, do think about your desires. I mean, some of your desires are not necessarily reasonable, but if it's important for you to get hold of something or to achieve something, then maybe that Mars sextile Pluto is going to help. Additionally, the Earth and Chiron are still making a conjunction in the same way that geocentrically the Sun and Chiron are still making an opposition. They're the same aspect, essentially. But with Earth conjunct Chiron, it could be that some of us, still want to be different. We want to stand out. It's just not acceptable to just follow the crowd, do the usual stuff. We have a different approach, and it's time to show that approach, show our ideas, and we shouldn't be too afraid of rocking the boat. Sometimes that is necessary. And additionally, Mercury is making an opposition to Jupiter. So Mercury in Capricorn, opposition Jupiter in Cancer. Remember, this is a heliocentric aspect. And so with Mercury opposition Jupiter, it could be that some of us have got a lot to say, and we might say what's on our mind in a way that could be a little bit clumsy. I mean, it is Mercury opposition Jupiter. It's not Mercury trine Jupiter. The words don't necessarily come out in a very smooth way, but with some effort, we can communicate, we can get our message across. Of course, it might not be us, it might be someone else. So, when you hear other people talking, not necessarily other people, just other people, maybe other organizations, politicians, when you hear them talk, it's not very smooth, and it might feel a bit sort of contrived, but in the end, we'll understand the meaning, even if it takes a long time to understand. It's not perhaps a time when messages are clearly articulated. So now I want to look at the weekend from the viewpoint of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for the weekend of October the 18th and 19th, 2025. Aries. It is a weekend of two parts. The beginning of a weekend, on Saturday, Aries, there are probably a lot of things that need to be dealt with. Perhaps they're just hanging over from earlier in the week. You kind of half finished them, but you didn't go all the way, and you would prefer to just move on. But if you're honest with yourself, you'll recognize that moving on just isn't necessarily an option. So if you feel that you've got sort of half-finished tasks in front of you, maybe because you have been negligent, or perhaps someone else has been negligent, or something just got forgotten, then I think the best approach is to just sort of get on with it and not complain too much. Okay, you might feel that you're being taken for granted, you're having to do something which someone else is quite capable of doing, but I don't think it's really a time for complaining. I think if you just sort of get on with it, it should be okay. Though it's important not to be too mechanical about it. If you see that something needs to be done, just don't just do it in a robotic kind of way. Think about what it means, and think about perhaps what it says about other people and the world in which you live, because people leave their traces, and if someone has been careless and you can see evidence of their carelessness, okay, you don't have to take them to task straight away, but it still gives you insights. And also, there are several ways of doing the same thing, and the obvious way is not necessarily the right way. And this is especially the case if there's a social dimension. Other people have their particular sensitivities, and it's not necessarily enough just to execute your responsibilities. You do have to execute your responsibilities with a certain amount of sensitivity. Now, Aries, you might argue that it is unnecessary. Why should you? Particularly if you feel that you're being taken advantage of. Being taken advantage of in the sense that, other people are not necessarily pulling their weight, but it just might be a time, certainly on Saturday, where you need to, be patient and perhaps, be tolerant. I mean, there's no need to martyr yourself, and if you're honest with yourself, it's not such a big deal if you're doing something that someone else was perfectly capable of doing. Now, moving into Sunday, there is a bit of a change because the moon is moving into Libra, and the moon moving into Libra. Well, the Libra is your opposite sign, and I think, Aries, you can probably afford to be more sociable, and you don't necessarily have to keep things to yourself. And and additionally, you can benefit from other people up to a point. I mean, you can benefit from people in terms of ideas in an intellectual way, and perhaps in terms of amusement. It's always good to be given variety and to find out what other people are thinking about, what other people are planning, but you don't want to find yourself getting too close to any one person, because there's just some danger of you getting confused and not really knowing what's going on and coming to the wrong conclusions. So avoid too much closeness. Another reason to avoid closeness is that Mercury is making a conjunction to Mars. Now, that Mercury conjunction to Mars is exact on Monday, but it's getting more and more noticeable. And with Mercury conjunct Mars, there could be moments where you just get angry and you perhaps have to, or feel you have to, express that anger. And you can be verbal. And why would you be verbal? Because you need to assert yourself, but perhaps because you've got yourself into a situation where you have got angry, where you realize what someone is doing, what someone is saying. You perhaps take the view that someone's behavior is unacceptable. But why would you get into that situation? You get into that situation perhaps because you've got too involved with something. So heavy emotional involvement and heavy social involvement, getting too wrapped up in another person's life or other people's lives, would probably be undesirable, simply because it would just lead potentially to a difficult situation. Taurus. You start Saturday in, I think, a relatively good mood. You are aware of what you can do, and you have a keen sense of your abilities and the things that you're really good at. And at the same time, Taurus, you can get a fair amount of appreciation. And appreciation does matter. Taurans don't like to be unappreciated. And they can get annoyed, and Taurans can keep that annoyance to themselves. They're not necessarily upfront about their feelings of being ignored or neglected or discounted, but the feelings are there, and the feelings can sort of brew and just get stronger and ferment, and then at a certain point they can just release themselves, and that is not particularly desirable, but it is not something that needs to happen. I think that if you have a strong sense of who you are, what you can do, getting it right, and that should be enough. I mean, it's not though that you have to completely ignore other people. I mean, you do have the moon opposition Saturn, and this moon opposition Saturn, it just could be that you just feel that you're not getting enough appreciation. And if you feel like that, perhaps you have to ask yourself, what is it about? Is it about someone treating you in a way that is genuinely bad? Or it could possibly be that you've got unrealistic expectations. You're not the only person in anyone's life, I don't think. There are other people have other priorities, and they just might not have the time for you, or at least in terms of devoting hours and hours to your particular needs. And so that is a good reason to be, quite independent and not feel that you are relying on another person to give you the support that you feel you need. But as I've already said, don't allow things to sort of build up. And if there's something bothering you, then perhaps the earlier you talk about it, the better. And then Sunday is perhaps a different day. I mean, it is a different day because the moon is changing sign. The moon moves out of Virgo, moves out of an earth sign, and moves into Libra. It's kind of a bit of a shame that the moon is moving out of an earth sign, because there's not much earth around, as I keep saying. We've got no planets in Capricorn, no planets in Taurus. On Saturday we've just got the moon in Virgo, and then Sunday the moon moves out of Virgo into Libra, and that's it. So on Sunday there may be moments where you feel a bit sort of dislocated. You don't quite know where you are. There's nothing necessary to hold on to, but that's okay. I mean, I think that you perhaps have to create some order, and also to create some stability, and it's just not there straight away. And it just might be, Taurus, but through your own efforts you can create an environment for yourself that feels secure, where you feel a degree of harmony and balance, and that's just something that you're going to have to work on. Now, the moon, by the way, when it moves into Libra, it does make trines to Uranus and Pluto. So we do have this grand trine in air signs on Sunday. I mean, okay, it depends on your time zone to an extent, but I think it's going to be really be on Sunday where you have that grand trine in air signs. And this grand trine can allow you to do some good work if necessary, and to think about what needs to be done. And it is about the mind. It's not that you necessarily have to put yourself out, that you have to dig a hole, for example, a real hole with a real spade. It's not like you have to do that, but you have ideas about how best to handle your time, and also you're starting to think about your ambitions, and what you need to get together if you want to be completely successful. And so do think about that. And you don't necessarily have to act, but you can have sort of ideas, and with these ideas, you can move into the new week feeling quite confident that you've really understood what is going to be required of you. Gemini, a Saturday and Sunday are different days. I mean, obviously, Saturday and Sunday are different days, but you can't just categorize Saturday and Sunday as just being the weekend. Saturday and Sunday do have distinct properties. On Saturday, probably a Gemini, you're going to be relatively retiring. You are going to, I think, appreciate your own company. You're not necessarily going to want to be taking risks, going anywhere new. And that can be a Gemini trait. You think about Geminis are always on the lookout for variety, but it's not necessarily true. Geminis, have got active minds, and they are able to deconstruct things. What is the point of doing this? What is the point of going to visit somewhere the other side of the world? Travel. Well, you can see the photographs. You can look at it on the internet. Do you actually need to go there? And this is what Geminis can sometimes think. And because of that, variety is not the be-all and end-all. And I just don't think on Saturday you're particularly in the mood for variety. You just want to do things your way, and you don't really want too many complications. But the moon is making an opposition to Saturn, and the moon opposition to Saturn might suggest that on Saturday there are a few things you reluctantly have to deal with. It just may be just responsibility, something you're supposed to be doing, something you don't want to do, but you kind of know you have to do it, and so that is the right thing to do. So don't get too stuck into your own way of doing things on Saturday, or while you don't have to really go out of your way, you should listen to what people are saying and listen to the demands that are being placed upon you and the expectations that are being placed upon you, and just agreeing, even if it's reluctantly, to do something someone else's way. It won't take as long as you'd imagined, and perhaps it's about appearances, but you don't want to fall out with anyone unnecessarily. Then on Sunday, the moon is in Libra. Well, it kind of depends where you are, but for example, if you're in Europe, then early in the morning, or Africa, early in the morning, the moon moves into Libra. If you're in the Americas, even earlier. So moon in Libra, if you're a Gemini, that's good, because when the moon moves into Libra, it makes a trine to Uranus, it makes a trine to Pluto. In other words, there is a grand trine in air signs. And this might mean that Sunday as a day is a lot more exciting and interesting than Saturday. I mean, it's normally the other way round. I think usually Saturday there are things going on, and on Sunday everyone is not wanting to do much. They kind of realize that the working week is in front of them, and it gets a bit dark and tedious Sunday. I mean, at least that's my experience of the difference between Saturday and Sunday. But this weekend, I really do feel that Sunday is a better day than Saturday. I think that you're going to be sort of more inspired, you're going to be more open-minded, and you can perhaps find ways of enjoying yourself that might not have been available to you on Saturday. So perhaps all your efforts and your energies should be focused on Sunday. And if you, for example, have any socializing to do, when you've got a choice, do you go for Saturday, do you go for Sunday? Well, I would perhaps advise you to go for Sunday, because Sunday there is more flow, there is more movement, and of course on Saturday you've got that moon opposition Saturn, which isn't particularly easy. I mean, it might be useful, it might be sort of dynamic and force you to do things which are good for you, but if something is good for you, that doesn't necessarily mean you enjoy it, particularly if Moon and Saturn are involved. But yeah, Sunday, yes, looks an easier day when things are going to flow to a greater extent, especially on a mental level. And if you want to express your ideas and your ideals, and if you want to be free, then on Sunday you can perhaps find what you're looking for, and it's not going to be difficult. On Saturday things could be difficult. Getting things together should just be hard work. You have to put in the effort. But on Sunday, yeah, things are going to be a lot easier. Cancer. The moon is making an opposition to Saturn on Saturday, and moon opposition Saturn isn't the greatest of aspects, and moon opposition Saturn can be discouraging, and it might remind you that you and other people are not always on the same wavelength. There can be disagreements, and disagreements can take many forms. They can be about things which really aren't worth bothering about. It can be about ideas, principles, philosophies, politics. So this can be where the problem lies. So perhaps Cancer, over the weekend, well, particularly on Saturday, you should avoid controversial subjects. People are so precious about their ideas. Ideas which have no relevance to their everyday lives. They just get worked up about what's going on in another part of the world. Maybe it's the Middle East or Gaza or Ukraine or Russia or some place where there's controversy, or it could just be some political issue, in your home country, wherever it might be, or even in your locality, and people get worked up about it. And I think that these kind of issues should probably be avoided. Or if you do find yourself talking about politics and religion, it might be a good idea to talk about things in a general sense. It's a bad idea to actually make it clear what you think, what you believe, because that might make the wrong impression. And of course, Cancer, you probably do have strong beliefs. Cancerians tend to have a strong sense of right and wrong, and it's perhaps quite close to the surface at the moment. And then moving to Sunday. Sunday is perhaps a more grounded day. The moon moves out of Virgo and it moves into Libra, and with the moon in Libra, you want things to be straightforward. You don't want to have to take any risks. You don't want to have to go out of your way to do anything, and you don't want to be pressured. I mean, there might be some vague pressure. The moon in Libra does make an opposition to Neptune, and that Neptune could represent maybe someone telling you what to do without really knowing what they're asking. And so perhaps you just shouldn't be pressured. Even if someone is trying to pressure you, you have to ask, what are they trying to achieve? And it just could be that you can ignore outside pressure and instead just do things your way, with moon conjunct moon and moon moving through Libra, and you can still make some interesting discoveries. And I mean, the moon in Libra is making trines to Uranus and Pluto, but these trines are kind of quite personal. They don't have to be revealed. They're not overly dramatic. I mean, they're not dramatic in an external sense. It's still about your mind, working things through, and working out, what is the best approach, what might be the best approach, and it does take a bit of time, but just go with it. And That way, Cancer, I think that you can probably have a reasonable weekend. It's quite a quiet weekend if possible. I mean, that's what you should be aiming for. And particularly on Sunday, your own space is important, and perhaps there are things you can do in your own home, ideas about your home. With this grand trine and air signs, it is about thinking about what you could do in your living space and the kind of thing you want to create, what you want to bring down. And it might be quite abstract, but there is something going on there. And so Cancer, I think you can have a good weekend, but try to avoid drama. You don't need drama, you don't want drama, and I think in most cases drama can be avoided. And also, I should say, Moon opposition Saturn on Saturday, relationships may not always work. And I talked about the possibility of you having disagreements about things like politics and spirituality, but it might just be about a general misunderstanding. And so as far as one-to-one relationships on Saturday, I think Sunday is a bit different. Sunday is not such a problem, but on Saturday, there just could be a general lack of ease when you get too close to another person. I think it's a passing issue. I don't think it's going to last the whole weekend, but on Saturday you just might have to be a bit careful, and a bit of aloofness might not be such a bad idea. Leo, it's important, I think, to have a certain amount of objectivity, not to feel that you know the answers, to be too sure of yourself, to believe that you really need to make a scene because you hear something you don't approve of. Instead, just float through things without getting too attached. And so if you can have a lack of attachment, especially with other people, I just think it's going to just make things so much easier. And you perhaps may run into situations where you could get angry, where you could spend too much time listening, for example, to what another person is saying. But I think such an approach would be mistaken. Instead, you need to keep a distance. You can still talk to people, you can still involve yourself with other people, but I think maybe you need a distance. It's certainly an intellectual distance and an emotional distance. And you're not engaged. You don't want to be too engaged. And if you have strong opinions, I would think that at the moment it just might be best that you keep it all to yourself. I'm not suggesting that you repress anything, but sometimes it's just best to just float and not court argument, because once you get involved in any sort of arguments, it could be difficult. Especially now when we have a conjunction between Mercury and Mars. This Mercury-Mars conjunction. Well, it's exact on Monday, but it's about things that could annoy you. And this Mercury-Mars conjunction, it's in Scorpio. It's in quite an important angle of your chart. And if you get worked up about something, it may be difficult to know when to stop. And you don't want to get worked up about things. It's just not going to be helpful. And that's another good reason why you shouldn't take anyone too seriously. Listen to what they say, but just move on. You don't need commitment. You don't need to spend too long in any one place. Though sometimes it may be difficult to avoid aggravation. Saturday, for example, we've got an opposition aspect between the Moon and Saturn, and this opposition aspect between Moon and Saturn, it could be about money. Could be something of a financial nature that you find annoying, just really irritating. Perhaps you are listening to someone else talk about money, or it could be your attitudes to money cause offense. That is possible, and so that is another good reason to be objective, to not be closely involved with anything. And where there's money, there's a problem on Saturday. So maybe you should think ahead. And if you think that money is going to come up, if you think that people are going to complain about money, if you think you're going to complain about money, then adjust your behavior. Perhaps it might mean you just don't want to talk to someone, or you make an effort to steer the conversation away from financial matters. Now on Sunday, things change. The moon moves out of Virgo, moves into Libra. So I do think moon moving into Libra, things are going to be easier, and there's going to be a greater sort of intellectual movement, and you can talk about things that you find interesting. The moon is not just in Libra, but it's making trine aspects to Uranus and Pluto. In other words, there is a grand trine in air signs, and so from a social perspective, things are happening. You can listen to people, you can talk to them, you can share ideas, and it's less likely that there's going to be stress and arguments, disagreements, people having their own agendas. So Sunday does seem to be a day which is more straightforward. But I come back to that Mercury-Mars conjunction. That Mercury-Mars conjunction is going to be closer on Sunday than on Saturday. And so perhaps on Sunday you should avoid things that are too familiar, like your family, for example. I think it's fine to talk to your friends or be with your friends, but if you spend a lot of time with members of your family, particularly if there have been recent problems, then that Mercury-Mars might start to manifest. Someone getting annoyed, maybe you getting annoyed. And although we often think that you should stick to familiar ground, stick to places it's likely that you're going to get most annoyed when you are on familiar ground. If you go somewhere you've never been before, where you don't know the rules, where you're not in any sense, where you don't have any great sense of belonging, then strangely you could be more relaxed. So perhaps on Sunday, things that are too familiar should be avoided. Virgo. Mercury is making a conjunction to Mars. I've talked about this conjunction before. This Mercury-Mars conjunction is exact on Monday, but it's getting close. So you might see this conjunction as being about Mars causing a problem. And so the question is, what is Mars? Mars could be another person. Mars could also be your anger. And there could be things, Virgo, that you find to be genuinely annoying. And right now, Virgo, I think that you're going to be particularly good at expressing your annoyance. Remember that Virgo is quite a verbal sign, it can be, and you can have a way with words, and you just know how to hit people with the right words. One word can be like a torpedo, and it hits the target, and can cause a lot of damage, and can really force people to sit up and listen and to think. But you do have to be careful with Mercury conjunct Mars. It can be provocative, and you can provoke, and also you can be provoked. So with Mercury conjunct Mars, you can be quick to respond to what other people are saying and doing, and you might be quick to take offense, and quick to become angry. And that means, Virgo, that perhaps you should try to have a little bit of distance. Don't take things so personally. But it might be difficult not to take things personally, especially on Saturday, because on Saturday there is a an opposition between the moon and Saturn. So, moon is moving through Virgo on Saturday, your sign, opposition Saturn in Pisces, and that moon opposition Saturn can be about a disagreement. You perhaps think that you and someone else do not agree. You might regard someone else as having the capacity to just hold you back, and that has been a growing feeling over the last few weeks, that you're not entirely free. You've always got to consider what other people want, and that moon opposition Saturn could make it really crystal clear. And the question then is, what do you do? And I think the first question you have to ask yourself is, to what extent is your freedom of movement and action and thought being genuinely constrained by another person? Maybe it is, or maybe not at all. Maybe you're just being self-conscious. Maybe you would be limiting yourself, even if you were alone, even if you were on a desert island. And so you do have to think about your own psychology and whether you're dealing with real effects, or instead it just could be something about your projections. So do think about that. Then on Sunday, moon moves into Libra. So moon moves out of Virgo, and moon moving into Libra makes a grand trine in air signs. Moon in Libra making a trine to Uranus, trine to Pluto, and I think that this grand trine in air signs really can work in your favor. Sometimes you need a bit of air. Virgos can just be focused on the material world, and they can see what they have to do. They can see the tasks in front of them, and it can just be a bit boring, and it can just sort of grind you down a little. But having this grand trine in air signs, you start to see possibilities, real possibilities, how you could do things differently. And the moon in Libra is it's making a trine to Uranus, so that in itself can be quite inspiring. You can start to see what you can do differently, and perhaps also how you can organize things differently, because the moon is making a trine to Pluto. And so Virgo, by the end of a week, you'll perhaps recognize that you don't have to do things in the same old way, and at the same time you can take active steps to make some of your ambitions become real. And I'm thinking in particular some of your crazier ambitions. An ambition can be genuinely crazy and unachievable, but ambitions can also be original, and with the right preparation and work, they can be achievable. And so don't be afraid to be original, certainly on Sunday. And just remember, Uranus is in Gemini. Uranus is an important sector of your chart. The moon is triggering it. And so if you want to do something different this year, this side of Christmas, then probably the sooner you get on with it, the better. If you leave it too late, then you might miss your chance for 2025. Okay, 2026, it is different, and it's different. The moon, Uranus will move, because Uranus moves out of Gemini pretty soon, and then moves retrogrades through Taurus, but then next year it will be back into Gemini. So it's not like you're missing any opportunities forever, but still it would be good if you could make the most of what is in front of you. And I think that Sunday could be quite a powerful day for you, when you can really tune into your own originality. Libra, Saturday, Sunday, two rather different days, I think. On Saturday, the moon is moving through Saturday moon is moving through Virgo. And with the moon moving through Virgo, you may not feel particularly inspired, for most of the day. Not necessarily all of the day. it might feel that there isn't so much going on. And while it's true that the moon is making fortunate aspects to Mars and Jupiter, it's also making an opposition to Saturn. And this moon opposition Saturn Libra might just feel as if it's just holding you back, and you're having to do stuff that you just don't really want to do. And at the same time, there just could be a few worries that are probably irrational, but they are holding you up, and you can't do everything that you would like to do. And so it might be that Saturday could turn into, quite a frustrating day. On the other hand, if you feel frustrated, if you feel annoyed, I don't think other people will necessarily pick up on it. They may not pick up on the way you feel. And it's indeed possible that you are able to make a good impression, even if you don't feel particularly good about yourself. I think you can make a good impression, and you can, to an extent, benefit from other people. Perhaps benefit from other people's generosity. And when I say generosity, I'm probably talking mainly about sort of emotional generosity. People are ready to listen. People are ready to be there for you, even if you're not in the greatest of moods. Then Saturday changes into Sunday, and I think that there is an improvement. For a start, the moon is moving into Libra, and moon moving into your sign. That's always good news, isn't it? And the moon in Libra makes trines to Uranus and Pluto, so we've got a grand trine in air signs, and this grand trine in air signs definitely picks up your sign. It picks up Libra because the moon is in Libra. And so on Sunday, it may feel that things are starting to move. And I'm saying this to quite a lot of people, that Sunday by and large should be a better day than Saturday. And at the same time, if you're feeling to begin with that things aren't great, there is a bit of a pessimism during the first half of the weekend, which may spill into Sunday. But I think you can do something about it, because there is a quintile aspect between Venus and Jupiter. Remember, Venus is your ruler. So quintiles is an aspect about what you can create. And Jupiter is, of course, a planet of good fortune. It's in Cancer. It's a planet that is really trying to work on your side. It's working in your favor if you handle it correctly. And with Venus quintile Jupiter, you have an opportunity to almost decide that you want to be lucky, decide that you want to get away from all the pessimism and problems that perhaps had been sort of cropping up, maybe on Saturday, maybe earlier in the week, and you can rise above it all through your own efforts, through your own positivity. Positive thinking can work. I'm not saying it always works, but I think right now with this Venus quintile Jupiter, your positivity can definitely pay dividends, in many different ways, and you can see that what you perhaps thought was going nowhere, what you used to be negative about. If you look at it in a different way, you can start to see the possibilities, and it's a situation where, to a great extent, you can create your own happiness. And as you move into Sunday, things really are moving with this grand trine in air signs. And so don't be satisfied with the way things are. And if you want some action, particularly on a mental level, I think you can certainly find it. And maybe also Libra, you can stir things up. You've got something to offer. You can almost bring something down to earth. The power of Uranus and Pluto. Uranus and Pluto are about purpose, but they're also about freedom, and this is something that you can demonstrate. And I think that other people will enjoy it if you can be yourself, and if you can show that you are not just interesting but also original, and in your own way spectacular. Yeah, you can be spectacular, at least relative to other people. Scorpio. Mars is close to Mercury, and this Mercury-Mars conjunction could have an influence on you over the weekend. So this Mercury-Mars conjunction, I've talked about it before, but it's in Scorpio, it's in your sign, and it may say a lot about how you present yourself and how you respond. And you perhaps at the moment are unusually verbal. I know that Scorpio doesn't necessarily have a reputation for being verbal, although some Scorpios can be extremely verbal. They can be very effective they can be very effective communicators, perhaps because they just understand. They are perhaps in touch with deeper emotions that not everyone gets, the emotions of the collective. And maybe at the moment, Scorpio, you can be in touch with the emotions of the collective, and this can inform you as you talk, as you communicate, and you can, I think, get an audience. And also, Scorpio, it is a very good time to express your anger. I mean, there are some things that are worth getting annoyed about. If something isn't going right, or if you feel that there's some injustice going on, well, you can intervene and you can express your annoyance in a way that can be very effective. So overall, Scorpio, it's probably not a time to be quiet. Some things just have to be said, and your style of language could be a bit difficult. It could be overly aggressive, but does that really matter, provided you're able to get your point across? Though if you keep trying to assert yourself, you keep trying to get an audience, well, it can be exhausting. And maybe by the time you move into Sunday, you could just feel that you've had enough. You've done your bit. You've said what was on your mind, and now you can perhaps drift into the background, and at some level that's perhaps how you'd like it to be. So perhaps Saturday is the day for action, or time when you maybe want to finish things off and confront anything that doesn't seem right. But then on Sunday, I think that you perhaps have a chance to be yourself, and not feel that there's anything that you absolutely have to do. Sagittarius. It could be argued that Saturday is just a continuation of Friday. I mean, the moon was in Virgo on Friday. It's going to be in Virgo on Saturday. So many of the things that you have to deal with on Friday, you might still have to deal with them on Saturday as well. So I know that Saturday is supposed to be the weekend, Friday is a weekday, but I'm not sure if there's necessarily a neat sort of divider between the 2 days. And so it could be that on Saturday you perhaps feel that you just can't relax because there are important things that you need to be concentrating on. And if you can do anything practical of perhaps a career nature, or something that you regard as being important, something to do with your ambitions, then I think that would be fine, up to a point. Now, there is an opposition aspect between the moon and Saturn, and it just could be that your attempts to do things your way and to pursue your ambitions, whatever those ambitions might be, could run into some resistance. It might, for example, be that there are other responsibilities, perhaps unique to the weekend, maybe relating to your home or your family, and other people want attention, but you've got your priorities, and what do you do? Well, you have to get the balance right. it's a day, Saturday, when you've got to try your hardest to please everyone. And of course, one person you need to please is yourself. You've got your priorities, which should not be ignored. But at the same time, other people have their needs. And, if you spend your time with other people, if you live under the same roof as other people, they're going to want some attention. And so you can't be too extreme, one way or another. But I think you should be able to handle it because, the moon in Virgo, it does make a trine to Jupiter. It also makes a trine to, I think it makes a trine to Mercury and Mars. So Sagittarius, you will have sufficient sensitivity and subtlety to understand what is required of you. I think emotionally you will be on quite good form on Saturday, and so even though you might have some priorities that you really feel are important, you're not going to be ignoring other people. You'll be able to feel them. You'll be able to feel their presence, even if they're not in the same room. You'll feel the vibes, and because of that, you really can get the balance right. It is about sensitivity, but it's also about self-interest, and it's not necessarily the case that sensitivity and self-interest are mutually exclusive. You can bring everything together. Then, as you move into Sunday, I think some of the pressure is off. I think you're going to be less concerned to do things your way, and I think that you're going to find it easier to relate to other people. The moon, it's not just going into Libra, but it's making a conjunction to Venus. It's also making a grand trine. Moon is making a trine to Uranus, trine to Pluto, and all of a sudden you perhaps could be aware that by spending time with other people, you can be not just amused, but perhaps you can be interested and enlightened as well. So you don't have to do everything on your own, and you haven't got all the ideas. Other people have got their own ideas, and on Sunday you can share these ideas. And so if you have got sort of plans of a social nature, then I think it's probably quite important that you focus them on Sunday. I think if you try to enjoy yourself on Saturday, it might be hard work. You just might not be quite in the mood. But Sunday is very different. I think that you can relax. You can even be the life and soul of the party if that's what you so wish. So as far as enjoyment is concerned, I think that Sunday is going to be a much better day than Saturday. As far as practical use and pursuing your own ambitions are concerned, it's different. So perhaps Saturday is about what is important to you in terms of achieving things, and then Sunday, you can be more relaxed, and you can put the focus on other people and their interests, but you don't have to worry too much about compromising yourself. I don't think you will. I think you've got a keen sense of what is important, what your priorities are. So the weekend doesn't look too bad. And just remember that Saturday and Sunday could be different, and there could be very different priorities on those 2 days. Capricorn, there is increasing emphasis on the sign Libra, and this becomes clear on Sunday. So start of the weekend, the moon is in Virgo, then it moves into Libra on Sunday. So on Sunday you've got three planets in Libra, and I think that is, that's quite good. Libra is an important sign for you, Capricorn. Libra is about, where you want to go, how you want to proceed, how you understand your ambitions for the future. And there is a practical side to it, but you want to stand out. I mean, you should be standing out, and issues around status could be important. So your major efforts and your major focus should perhaps be on Sunday rather than Saturday. I think that Sunday is a very clear day. Saturday is maybe a little more complicated. Things aren't necessarily entirely straightforward. On Saturday, for example, we've got a opposition aspect between the Moon and Saturn, and so Saturday suggests that there just could be a few things that need to be negotiated. Perhaps things of an interpersonal nature. So when you think about Moon opposition Saturn, you could say that you and another person might have different priorities. There might be things that you need to work out. To really try to understand another person's view, understand your own view, or at least get another person to understand your view. And there could be some negotiating, and it's not always going to be easy. And some people could be irritating. People who are very important to you could still be irritating, and they just could be grating. And so Saturday does require some work, I think, but work that of an interpersonal nature, and it just may take some time. Whereas moving into Sunday, you can start to think about what is important to you, and I think that some of those outside pressures are going to diminish, and you're going to be thinking about what kind of impact can you have in the run up to a new moon. So we've got a new moon coming up. When is the new moon? The new moon is on, let me get this right, the new moon is on the 21st, which is a Tuesday. So there's a new moon on Tuesday. But the run-up to the new moon really does start on Sunday, because the new moon is in Libra. The moon goes into Libra on Sunday. And so something is coming together for you. And you don't necessarily have to do anything specific, but you are thinking about what you want to achieve, what kind of effects you want to have. And this relates to your desires, perhaps your desire for success or your desire for recognition. And part of that is about how you present yourself and how you present your agenda. And so that suggests that Sunday is a day when you are quite focused, you are quite practical, but you're nonetheless open to new ideas, because the moon, when it moves into Libra, it does make trines to Uranus and Pluto. So we've got grand trine in air signs. We've always, not always, but over the last sort of week or two, there's been a lot of stuff going on in air signs, and now we've got this grand trine involving Moon, Uranus, and Pluto. So this can potentially be quite inspiring, and you can see new possibilities that you weren't fully aware of before, and it might just be represent an opportunity to fine-tune. And when we talk about fine-tuning, we're fine-tuning a strategy maybe, and the fine-tuning is about you perhaps recognizing that you'd been maybe slightly less ambitious than you should have been. And by expanding forward, considering new possibilities, then you can start to align yourself. Or maybe you're aligning yourself to the future, because the moon trine Uranus, trine Pluto. Those Uranus and Pluto, these two transpersonal energies, which are manifesting right now. They're manifesting on Earth, and by aligning yourself to this, you are up to date. Your ideas are cutting edge. The way you present yourself is cutting edge. I mean, that's how you should see it. You're not you're not living in the past. You might appreciate the past. Capricorns do tend to appreciate the past. But at the moment, Capricorn, you're very aware of the future. And yeah, you can align yourself to the future in a way that can make you successful. Aquarius. Sunday is probably going to be a better day than Saturday. And the problem with Saturday is that we've got the moon still in Virgo, and the moon is making an opposition to Saturn. And of course, Saturn is your ruling planet. And this moon-Saturn opposition, it could represent just things that might annoy you, things that you probably don't necessarily want to deal with, but you have to deal with them, and things are just more involved than you'd like them to be. Yeah, we'd all like things to be straightforward and obvious and not have to worry about them, not have to think about them, not getting involved in complicated feelings and people being a law unto themselves. You'd like things to be simple, but I just don't think that Saturday is going to be simple. And of course, it does depend what you plan on doing. If you just concentrate on yourself and what is important to you, then maybe it's not such a big problem. But if there are people to deal with, then people can represent problems. They can be problematic, and you have to try as hard as you can to be objective, not to get caught up in sort of other people's issues, other people's problems. People get annoyed about things, but try not to engage. And if you can just try to be objective and aloof, well, I think that very much is the right approach. Now, moving into Sunday is a much better day than Saturday, I think. The moon is moving into Libra. Now, quite when the moon moves into Libra depends on your time zone, but if you're in Europe, Africa, the Americas, it'll move into Libra pretty early. By the time you're awake, well, of course, it does depend on your sleeping times, but certainly by fairly early in the morning, the moon will be in Libra, and it will be very much be operational there. And of course, Libra is an air sign. It's a sign that has a natural affinity with your sign, Aquarius, and so we've got moon trine Uranus, moon trine Pluto, grand trine in air signs. So that means, Aquarius, that things are moving, things are really coming together for you, and you are quite inspired. And Aquarius is an inspiring sign, and Sunday is an inspiring day. So allow things to happen. Allow your imagination to move, and move from one thing to another. But don't forget what is important. Don't completely drift off. There is a conjunction between Mercury and Mars. That Mercury-Mars conjunction in Scorpio is going to be exact on, I think, Monday. And so that Mercury-Mars conjunction could be quite motivating, and it might motivate you to not just think about possibilities, but to be able to act on them as well, and to make them part of your ambition structure. So Sunday looks like a good day when you really should be as active as possible. Really try to make the most of everything you've got, and then you can give your imagination free rein. But as soon as you realize things and you start to see possibilities, then your job is to bring them down to earth, and maybe write them down, form a plan. You can do all of this, and that does mean that as you move into the new week, then you're going to be very well placed to really do something special. Pisces. Moon opposition Saturn on Saturday. Moon opposition Saturn is probably not the greatest of aspects. You've got the moon in Virgo, your opposite sign, opposition Saturn. Of course, Saturn is in your sign. So that moon opposition Saturn across the main axis of your solar chart could say something about other people and other people's behavior. And, you may not be entirely happy with the way people are behaving. Perhaps it feels like they're just not being particularly considerate. And the moon is in the same sign as the South Node. And so it would be easiest, Pisces, if you were just to be tolerant, be accepting, let other people have their way. I mean, at least easiest in the short term. But I don't think that is the right approach. I think, Pisces, it is time to be thinking about yourself and to be thinking about what is important to you. And as Saturday moves into Sunday, you probably become stronger as the moon moves out of Virgo into Libra. You're able to be more self-contained, and you appreciate that there are some things you just can't compromise, and as a result you can be quite tough, and that toughness is going to be quite apparent as Sunday unfolds. And if you're going to be tough, it's just going to be important that you're not diverted from the course. I mean, there might be attempts to divert you from the course. You make a decision, you think you're going to do it, but then something comes up and you feel you've got to listen to what another person is saying or what another person is suggesting. But that would be a bad idea. You have to think about what is important to you, Pisces, and really give it everything. And just because other people are very insistent about something, doesn't necessarily mean that you should listen too hard to them. And ask yourself, do other people really have your best interests at heart? And in many cases, they probably don't. So, Pisces, I think it's important this weekend to be as independent-minded as possible. And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And now it is time to look at things from the perspective of the I Ching. So I ask the question, what is the weekend going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 33, which is retreat. So the message of this hexagram is that we should be retreating from something. We've perhaps gone as far as we can, and now it's time to think about how do we extricate ourselves from a situation. Now, that might be because there's some danger that if we were to carry on going in a particular direction, it just wouldn't work out and things might start to go wrong. So that is something to consider. So as you move into the weekend, think about what you're involved in, the various things that are important to you, and do you have to stay involved with them? And it could also be about a particular social scene you're involved with, and it might not just be might not be working out, but you've had enough. You realize the time has come for you to just make your excuses and just leave. Now we have two moving lines. The third line moves and the sixth line moves. Now the third line moving kind of indicates that, at least to begin with, you might be in a situation where it's actually quite difficult to extricate yourself. You might try your hardest, but perhaps you've made commitments, there are expectations, and you just may find that you don't get much support for your plans. Maybe there's pressure on you to stay where you are. Moral pressure, social pressure, And or you could look. Well, you're thinking, well, if you were to retreat, who are you going to offend? And so there is a temptation to just stay where you are and not to retreat. And you're starting to realize then that you might not have much freedom. And one symbol of this hexagram is being bound, sort of being tied up in knots. And yeah, if you're tied up in knots, you cannot retreat. And so, where is the action? Well, there's only action if you're planning on restricting another person. I mean, that third line moving, I mean, it is good. The I Ching says it's good for capturing prisoners. So if you're in the business of capturing prisoners, you're looking for people on the run, for example, then yeah, that third line is good. But in other situations, it's just not so good, and it just may be very difficult to see things through because there is so much resistance, and because you are bound perhaps by ties of obligation. Then the top line moves, sixth line. The sixth line is not so bad. The sixth line is quite a good hexagram, and it says that you reach a point where you can retreat, and you can do it in a way that is graceful, that people understand what you're doing. So it could be about timing. So you may be in a situation where you want to leave, but if you try to leave too early, there'll be a lot of resistance, and you won't be able to get away with it, and it'll all be just not very natural. But perhaps you just need to wait for the right moment, and then if you want to leave, you can. That is certainly an option. But there is another way of looking at this top line. You could say that retreat represents a movement. This is everything that you want to do. And the top line is the end of the movement. The time for retreat is over. Maybe you've retreated to some extent, but perhaps you can continue with the advance. And so things might change. Maybe the things are starting to change in your favor. We don't necessarily have to think about retreat so much, and perhaps you can sort of hold your ground. I'm not saying that you can sort of advance, but maybe the time for retreat will pass, and in the end it might not be necessary. But you've got to look at the situation. Now, because you've got two moving lines, that does mean we move to a second hexagram, and the hexagram we move to is hexagram number 45, which is gathering together, which is kind of the opposite of retreat, and particularly in a social sense. So we might have been trying to retreat from something, and then perhaps the situation changes. Maybe we don't need to retreat at all. And gathering together does indicate that you can be with people and enjoying other people's company. And, this maybe reflects the astrology. Reflects. It's not that one causes the other. There is no link between the astrology and the I Ching, not a logical link, but there is a sort of an acausal relationship there. And so the astrology, on Saturday you've got Moon opposition Saturn. It can be quite a difficult day, whereas Sunday we've got Moon in Libra, moving towards a conjunction of Venus. And so perhaps this is reflecting the fact that Saturday is a day for retreat, maybe, but Sunday is a day for doing the opposite, for gathering together, finding people who are on your wavelength. And yeah, it's not about retreat. And by finding the right group of people to be with, there can be real sort of satisfaction. And also there's a sense of joint purpose, coming together with people for a reason. And now I want to finish with the horoscope of Zohran Mamdani, who is the front runner to be mayor of New York in the election, which I think is on November the 4th. So in the thumbnail, top right, that is Zohran Mamdani. And on Saturday, today, the 18th, he is celebrating his 34th birthday. So a happy birthday, Zohran Mamdani. And so As far as his chart is concerned, well, there is an issue with his chart. I mean, I haven't really explored it, but when I set up his chart some months ago, when he first came in, hit the news, it seemed to be quite clear that his time was at 1:15 a.m. And this is, it was, I think, a sort of recognized time. But I was just looking at his horoscope again to see what has changed, because things do change, and now it's an unknown time. People seem to be less sure about his 1:15 a.m. Time of birth. So when you see that 1:15 a.m. birth time, it's not necessarily right. I don't know. But there are still people using 1:15 a.m. There are, recognized, established astrologers using 1:15 a.m. So if I'm going to keep using 1:15 a.m. and I make a fool of myself, maybe I'll be in good company. But I'm just warning you here of his time of birth. So don't necessarily set up his chart thinking that 1:15 a.m. is time, because it can be so embarrassing when a completely different time is discovered, because there might be me making these elaborate forecasts and statements about his personality based on 1:15 a.m., based on him having 0 degrees 1 minute Leo rising, and then you find out that he's born not at 1:15 a.m. but at 4 in the afternoon, and it just changes everything. So do bear that in mind. So he is the front runner, and his chart is interesting in a number of ways. I mean, he does not have any fire in his chart, and so if you've got no fire, what does that mean? And clearly, he is someone who inspires people. And it's not about what you think about his political views. I mean, as far as I can see, he's a Democrat. He sets himself up as a socialist, and he looks as if he's going to win. And so, having that lack of fire, well, there's nothing to do with his socialism and a lack of fire, but there's no relationship there. Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, who was a very charismatic Prime Minister, very politically, very astute. I mean, he kind of lost the plot when he got involved in the Iraq War, but he didn't have any fire in his chart, certainly no traditional planets in fire signs. But, he gave the impression of being a person who had fire, who had a real understanding of how things came together. And, likewise, perhaps with Zohran Mamdani, his lack of fire. But I don't really know enough about him to know how that lack of fire is working out. But perhaps he's attracted to the fire. If you've got no fire in your chart, you're attracted to the excitement. If you haven't got it yourself, you're going to look for it somewhere else. And instead, he's got Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Virgo. And, Venus-Jupiter in conjunction in Virgo. That is an interesting conjunction. I mean, it's good in one sense that he's got Venus and Jupiter, the greater and the lesser benefics, making a conjunction. On the other hand, Venus is fallen in Virgo, and Jupiter is in its detriment in Virgo. So that Venus-Jupiter conjunction strikes me as being rather self-interested. It's not just about making other people feel happy, doing good work. He is perhaps thinking about what he's doing. He is thinking about the personal benefit in everything with that Venus-Jupiter conjunction. And so, we shouldn't necessarily be fooled by surface appearances. There's something quite calculating about it, and he knows where the benefit is, and he knows what he has to do, and he knows who he needs to impress. And at the same time, he has got a square between Mars and Saturn, a very close Mars-Saturn square. Even if we don't know his time of birth. I mean, this chart is set for 1:15 in Kampala in Uganda, but even without a time of birth, Mars square Saturn is a potentially quite dangerous aspect. It can be quite frustrated. It's also an aspect which can be connected with death, and there is something grim about it. And I wonder to what extent we're going to see that Mars Saturn square manifesting. Also, how is he trying to deal with that Mars Saturn square? If you've got a Mars Saturn square, it's often said that a lot of activity, physical activity. People say, well, what's the cure for a Mars Saturn square? Martial arts, doing a lot of drumming, heavy physical activity, or embracing the Mars Saturn principle. I mean, if you worked in a cemetery or an undertaker's funeral parlor, then that would be a good way of using that Mars square Saturn. He would be embracing it. And so as far as what it means for him, well, yeah, he takes certain things seriously. And I'm talking about, but going back to the socialism, I think there is something earthy about socialism, and that Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Virgo is quite sort of socialistic. Capricorn, Virgo. These are two signs that are thinking about social conditions, and you could say, if you want to be positive about it, that Venus and Jupiter in Virgo are Virgo is a service sign, trying to help other people, make the best of things for them, putting yourself at other people's disposal. That is one way of looking at it. By the way, I'm not expressing any political opinions about Zohran Mamdani. This is not what I'm doing. I'm just describing his chart. So you might say with Venus Jupiter, that is about service. If you look at Virgo in the highest possible way, he has this fortunate Venus Jupiter conjunction, and he wants to make the most of it, and he wants to make people's lives better. That is a way of looking at it. That would be how a progressive astrologer might look at it. And of course, a lot of astrologers are progressive. And that Venus Jupiter conjunction is trine Uranus. So he was one of the generations born in the early 90s with that Uranus Neptune conjunction with the North Node, and so perhaps that Uranus trine Venus Jupiter, there is a certain excitement there, and he there's an energy there, and it's sort of Uranus in Capricorn. Okay, it's not the same as having a planet in fire signs, but perhaps it can be quite sort of motivating and exciting. Some of his ideas seem exciting. What he's going to do for people in New York, I mean, it relates to tax, it relates to housing. Wasn't the city going to set up their own supermarkets, their own grocery stores? Was that one idea? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked at Zohran Mamdani in great detail. Now, he has a conjunction between Mercury and Mars in Scorpio. So, there is a Mercury-Mars conjunction, right now in the sky, and it's going to be tied in with his solar return. So, the Mercury-Mars conjunction in Scorpio in his solar return, and he's got a Mercury-Mars conjunction, in his natal chart. So he's got Mercury trine square Saturn, and as well as Mars square Saturn. So Mercury is all linked up with that. And so Mercury conjunct Saturn can represent someone who could be an effective public speaker. I mean, that makes absolute sense. And the square Saturn, perhaps that creates a structure to his words. Now, as far as the ascendant is concerned, if he was born at 1:15 a.m., and we can't be sure about that, then he would have 0 degrees Leo rising, and so Mercury and Mars would be square his ascendant, would be on his IC, and he would have Saturn exactly on his IC as well. But can we rely on this 1:15 birth time? I'm just a bit concerned about it. And so those are a few thoughts about his horoscope. It's perhaps a good idea to look at some of his midpoints. I mean, the midpoints become impressive, particularly if we have a time of birth. But if without a time of birth, I'm just not sure. So this is a problem. It is a dilemma. So there is his Mars. There is his Mars Saturn. So his Mars Saturn square. So on a 90-degree dial, his Mars and Saturn, the Mars Saturn square will be shown as a conjunction. And so I think that is a very important aspect of who he is, that Mars Saturn. And if it's tied up with the ascendant, as this chart, because I'd say if he really was born at 1:15 and it's tied up with the ascendant, it almost strikes me as a bit dangerous. I think it's dangerous even without being tied up with the ascendant, but you throw the ascendant in as well, and that could certainly create some problems. And additionally, he's got Saturn on the Uranus-Pluto midpoint, so his Mars and Saturn are on the Uranus-Pluto midpoint, and so Uranus-Pluto is very collective. So Uranus-Pluto represents freedom, the desire to also transform society. And so perhaps Mars and Saturn on the Uranus-Pluto midpoint, putting in the effort, and it's really difficult, but you put in the effort and you transform society. But the question is, how much can he do in New York? Someone like that would be, better off running his own country, because New York, you've got all sorts of limitations on you. The mayor is not all powerful, but if he had his own country, it would just be easier for him, I think. So as far as what is happening to him, when you talk about predictive astrology, you've still got this. You've got this issue of time of birth. But if he was born at 1:15 a.m., it's certainly a very impressive solar return. Here is his solar return. I do my solar returns, I set them for the place of birth. I have not set this chart for New York. I've set it for Kampala. And if he was born at 1:15, he's got Jupiter exactly on the midheaven. And in Cancer, that is an absolutely great Jupiter. That would be a sure sign, not necessarily a sure sign, but would be a sign of success. But, even if we don't know his time of birth, his solar return does indicate a T-square. We've got a close Sun-Jupiter square, which is linked with Chiron. So it is a Sun-Jupiter opposition Chiron time for him. So Sun-Jupiter square, he, over the next coming year, well, I assume if the pundits are right, he's going to be mayor of New York. Sun square Jupiter might encourage him to really push things hard, to really make things happen, or at least try to make things happen. But the Sun is opposition Chiron, and Sun opposition Chiron is, going to be some kind of wound. That's one way of looking at it. Or Sun, if you regard Jupiter as being the maverick, someone who is different, who enjoys being different, particularly when Trump is president, you can imagine Sun opposition Jupiter really enjoying being the maverick, especially with Sun opposition Chiron with this T square. Enjoying being different, being someone who can be a real individual. So the solar return is powerful, and I think it is important that that he's got this Sun Jupiter square. Now, as far as how it's all going to unfold, so assuming he becomes mayor, and everyone is saying he will become mayor, when would be the first real crisis point? So looking at his chart, we know, if we're talking about transits, we know that we've got Saturn, Neptune, around the sort of Aries point, and he doesn't have a lot of planets, or at least personal planets, in cardinal signs. Okay, he's got the Sun in Libra, but when is Saturn going to be opposition his Sun? Well, not for ages, not for some time. But in the end, Saturn will go into Taurus, and it might be that when Saturn goes into Taurus, that could be when there are real problems, because he has Mars at 0 degrees Scorpio. He's got Mercury at 3 degrees Scorpio, and certainly Saturn at 0 degrees Scorpio. So that's really going to be quite something. If he is still mayor when Saturn goes into Taurus, that could be when all the problems start coming to the surface. So as far as when Saturn goes into Taurus, it starts going into Taurus in 2028, sort of beginning of 2028. Saturn starts moving into Taurus, I think April 2028. So in 2.5 years' time, that could be when he as mayor starts running into real trouble. So that's a note for the future. Finally, I wanted to look at his Vedic chart. Now, when you're looking at the Vedic chart, you have to remember that knowing the time of birth is important. So I would sort of add this rider that what I'm saying about him is dependent to a great extent on having a time of birth, and I'm going to this 1:15 a.m. chart. But if he was born at 1:15 a.m., his Venus-Jupiter conjunction really comes into focus. So here's his Vedic chart, and remember, he's got in his Western chart, he's got a Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Virgo. So that means in his Vedic chart, it goes back into Leo. So there is, assuming he's got Cancer rising, he's got Venus-Jupiter. He's got Venus-Jupiter conjunction in the second house. Now, Cancer rising, I did a video, was it yesterday? Was it the day before? I think the day before yesterday, I did a video saying that in the Vedic, from a Vedic perspective, Jupiter has gone into Cancer. Jupiter goes into Cancer. In fact, Jupiter goes into Cancer today, on his birthday. When I say Jupiter goes into Cancer, Jupiter goes into sidereal Cancer. And so when Jupiter goes into Cancer, it goes into his first house. So having Jupiter in Cancer in his first house as a transit, that should, all things being equal, be quite fortunate. And then in terms of his Vimshottari Dasha system, his Dashas, he is in his Jupiter major Dasha, and if he really was born at 1:15, his Venus subdasha started in March 2024 and goes through until November 2026. So he's in his he's in his Jupiter Mahadasha and his Venus subdasha. And his Jupiter is one of the strongest planets in his chart. So, and he's got a Venus-Jupiter conjunction. So if he really was born at 1:15 a.m. with a Venus-Jupiter conjunction, he's in his Jupiter Mahadasha and his Venus subdasha, then you would have thought that he's almost certain to get elected, and that is what the pundits are indeed saying. So that's powerful. One other thing, by the way, if he's born at 1:15 a.m., he's got Saturn exactly on the descendant, if that is the case. If that is true, that means in his Vedic chart he's got Saturn in Capricorn, because he's got Saturn in Aquarius Western, Saturn in Capricorn Eastern, and so that means he would have Saturn in Capricorn in the 7th house, and that means his Saturn would have Dikbala, which means it has directional strength in the 7th house, and that would potentially give him an incredible ability to defeat his enemies. And his enemies, his political enemies. Well, so far he's done a good job, hasn't he? But that does assume that he's really is born at 1:15 a.m. So those are some thoughts on Zohran Mamdani's chart. I'm not going to bother to make any predictions about the election, because from what I'm seeing, it's almost a certainty that he's going to be elected, unless something absolutely disastrous happens. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again very soon.